Hi everyone! Welcome to this new Unreal Engine crash course where I'm going to show you how we can use one of the new Unreal Engine tools called TextureGraph. But for those of you who don't know me yet, my name is M.Shahrokh. I'm an Unreal Authorized instructor and a technical artist. But first thing first, let's see what we are going to cover in this video and what you will be able to do at the end of this course. So I'm going to start by the TextureGraph editor introductions, and then we will see how we can get started with the TextureGraph within Unreal Engine 5.5. And of course, getting familiar with the user interface, and then we will start to modify and create some simple textures within the TextureGraph. So once we made those, we'll see how we can export those texture graphs, and finally we will cover the input and output parameters. So basically these are some of the learning objectives for this crash course, which will give you enough knowledge to create your own texture graphs. Or maybe building some reusable utilities with TextureGraph, which can benefit your production pipeline or your texturing pipeline. So without further ado, let's dive into it. Before getting into the engine, I would like to start by this question: what is TextureGraph Editor? And just by looking at the name, I can tell that it could be a tool for editing textures. And since we have graph in the name, I could say probably it's something similar to other graph editors that we have in the engine, like the material graph editor, the blueprint graph editors, and PCGgraph or render graph. One thing that all these graph editors they have in common is the fact that they are all node-based. So based on this definition, we can say that TextureGraph Editor is a node-based texture editor which was initially introduced in Unreal Engine 5.4 and then it got improved in Unreal Engine 5.5. It's still an experimental tool like the other Unreal Engine experimental tools, but it's super powerful, and it's a great news that we have a node-based texture editor right now inside of Unreal Engine. Because we were used to create and edit our texture usually using other DCC tools. But right now, just by connecting a bunch of nodes, we can generate and modify our existing textures, which is really great. And it can save us a lot of time. So technically, in a nutshell, here is how TextureGraph Editor works. So basically, it takes textures, materials, or material functions, or maybe some other type of nodes as an input data. Then it's going to process this input data with mass nodes or some other type of nodes, and then finally it's going to give us some new textures, and these textures they can be exported directly into our content browser. Another great feature of texture graphs is the fact that they can be combined with blueprint and editor utility widgets, which is going to allow us to create some custom blueprint tools or reusable utilities, which can be a great time saver when it comes to texture editing and creation. So using texture graphs can help us to have a more efficient texture editing and creation pipeline. So with that being said, let's get into Unreal Engine 5.5 and see how we can get started with TextureGraph Editor. Here I already launched the Unreal Engine 5.5 from the Epic Games launcher, and I'm going to create a new project using this blank template under the games category, and I'll keep all these settings as default. Then the project location is good, but I'm going to give it a name. I'll put TextureGraph Editor in the name, and I'm ready to hit the create button here to create that project. Then I'll wait for a few seconds for the shader compilation. And now that we are inside the Unreal Engine editor, the first thing that we should do in order to get started with TextureGraph in Unreal Engine 5.4 and 5.5 is the fact that we have to make sure that the TextureGraph plugin is enabled on the project. So to do so, I'm getting into my edit menu. I will look for plugins, click on the plugins here, and that will open the plugins window for us. And in the search box, I will look for TextureGraph. You can see that the TextureGraph is showing up here, and we just need to check that checkbox there. And immediately you will see this dialog message telling us that the plugin TextureGraph is an experimental plugin, and we already know that and we are good with that. So we just say yes, we are sure and we want to enable that plugin. So then it will ask us to restart the engine. So we will just hit this restart now button, and then again we will wait for another few seconds again. And now we are back to the engine. Look for TextureGraph. Sorry, TextureGraph, just to make sure it's enabled. Yes, it's checked and enabled, so we are good to close the plugins window. Since I'm inside an empty project, then I need to create some folders to make sure that my assets are organized inside the content browser. So I'm going to create some folders, textures. Then I'll need to create another folder called materials, maybe, and then blueprints and maps as well. Now that I have my folders, I'm going to create a new level as well, because I don't want to work with this open world template, the default map. I'll create a basic level, and then I will save that level as a different name here under the maps folder that I just created. I will save it as test map, and then save it. So now that I saved my level and I created the folders, I'm ready to get started with the TextureGraph editor, and I already enabled that TextureGraph plugin on the project. So what should I do here in order to get started with that? The main thing we should do here after enabling the plugin is the fact that we need to create a texture graph. And how we are going to create that texture graph, let me show you. So I'm getting into my textures folder, and then I will right click inside the content browser empty area, or I will just click on this add button here. Then I will get into the texture menu, and from the texture menu I will look for texture graph. Just by clicking on that texture graph, that will give us a texture graph asset inside the folder that we just created. So I'm going to give it a name, tg underscore test, and then hit enter. And now I just created a texture graph. The next thing that I'm going to do, I can just double click on this texture graph, and immediately you will see that the texture graph editor window will be open for us. And then before learning about TextureGraph, let's take a quick look at the user interface of the TextureGraph editor and see what are the panels and windows we have here. So to do that, I'm going to switch to the slides that I already prepared, where I'm going to highlight the different sections of the UI for you guys. So the first and main part would be the TextureGraph area. In this area, we are going to connect all our nodes together, and this is basically where we are creating our logics. So we can start by having some sort of input nodes, then adding some other nodes for some sort of, could be whatever type of calculation here. And then finally, we can have our output texture in the form of an output node. So where we are getting these nodes? We are getting these nodes from this area, the nodes palette. So the nodes palette is giving us access to a range of nodes for modifying and creating textures. So in this area, we have several different categories, like the adjustment category, channels, and each one of them have different kind of nodes for us. We can just drag them on the texture graph area and connect them together to create our texture logics. The other part that we have here is the details and parameters panel. The details panel is basically giving us all the properties of the nodes which is selected on the texture graph area. Right now we are having this texture node as a selected node, so that's why we can see the properties related to this node on the details panel here. So whatever node you select on the texture graph area, you can see the properties related to that specific node on the details panel. And on the parameters panel, we will see a list of all our parameters for that texture graph. The other area that we have here is the node preview and node histogram. The node preview is basically giving us a preview of whatever node which is selected on the texture graph area. So if you select any one of those nodes, you can see a preview of that node immediately in the node preview window. And then we have the node histogram, which is a new panel which has been added in Unreal Engine 5.5, I believe. And it's going to show us a histogram of that node. Then under that, you also have 3D preview and 3D preview settings. So in the 3D preview, you will see a live preview of the texture that you made on your texture graph. But you can see that texture is already mapped on a cube. Let's say if you are not happy with this type of mesh or the type of material which the mesh is using for previewing your texture, you can go on the 3D preview settings and change the type of mesh to any type of custom mesh, and also change the type of material to any custom material, and start mapping your output nodes with different slots of the PBR material that you are going to use there. The next part that we have here in the user interface is the main toolbar. In the main toolbar, like the other main toolbars in Unreal Engine editors, we have a button for save, and then there's a button for exporting our texture graph. Then we also have another two buttons for enabling and disabling the auto update and update. And then we have the Windows button there, which is allowing us to add and remove different panels from the user interface. So now that we learned about the user interface, let's see how we can start modifying or creating textures on the texture graph editor, and then how we can export them later on. So I'm getting back into the engine. We already created a texture graph here inside my textures folders, and I'm going to double click and open the texture graph editor. And right now you can see that I have an empty texture graph with one single output node here. And if I click on that output node, I see some parameters or some settings related to that output node on the details panel here. And these are basically the settings for the texture that we are getting as an output if we export this texture graph later on. So in order to start modifying textures, I would need a texture. So I need to import a texture into my project. And to do that, I'm going to add a texture from Fab. I'll just right click on the Fab here, and then I will get into the Quixel Mega Scans. I need to get into my library, then browsing Quixel Mega Scans, and here I will click on Material and Textures, and then I will add one of these materials to my project. Maybe we can go with this one, and we just need to select the quality. I'll set it to high quality, and I will add it to my project. And the moment I'm clicking on that button here, immediately you can see that material will be added to my Unreal Engine project under the Fab folder, Megascan Surfaces. Then we have everything related to this material here, all the textures and the material as well. So I'm going to right click on the folder and save all. Then I'm getting back into my texture graph editor. I'll just minimize that first here, and then getting back again to the folder where I had the textures. And if I want to, let's say, modify one of these textures, I can easily drag and drop that on the texture graph, and immediately a node called texture will be created for us there. We can name it like as an albedo or whatever name that we want to put there. And right now, since I clicked on this node, since this node is already selected, I can see a preview of that node immediately here on the node preview. But I don't see any output on my 3D preview here. And the reason for that is because there is no connection between this node and the output node. So in order to create that connection, we just need to simply drag a wire off the pink pin of the texture node and connect it to the white pin of the output node here. So I'm basically following the same order of execution that we have inside of other Unreal Engine graph editors. From left to right, we are going to connect the nodes together, and immediately I can see that I got the preview of the output node on my 3D preview window. So this is super simple right now, but what if we want to modify the texture? Let's say do some sort of operation on the texture. So we just need to simply drag one of these nodes from the node palette, or maybe right click or search for that node. Let's say if I want to add a color tint to our texture here, I just need to drag the color node here on the texture graph, and then I will change the color probably to whatever color that I like, maybe orangish, and then I need to add a tint of orange on top of my texture. So in order to do that, I'm going to drag a wire off the pink pin here and then look for multiply, and I will also connect this to the B pin here of the multiply, and now I'm going to connect the output of the multiply to the output pin, and you can see that we got this kind of color tint on top of our albedo texture, and we can change the color right now to any other color. Then we can add more nodes to our texture graph and make it as complex as we want. Let's say, what if we want to change the brightness and contrast of the albedo texture that we got here? So for that, I'm going to drag and drop the brightness and contrast node to our texture graph and making some space here for that. So I'll just drag a wire from my multiply node to the brightness and contrast, and from that to the output node. And then finally we got that connected to our chain of nodes, and since this is already selected, I can change the properties of that node. I can change the brightness value, then I can also change the contrast. So I'll change the contrast to something like this one, and then maybe I will just add a little bit of brightness to it. And then we got from this texture, from this initial texture to here, and then from this one to that, we added more contrast here, and then finally this is going to be our output. So depending on what I'm trying to achieve here, I can add even more nodes. Let's say, what if I want to apply a blur filter to my texture? And as you know, this filter can be really expensive in a material, but I can add it right away to my texture. So in order to do that, I will just right click here and look for blur, and then I can connect that to my brightness and contrast output, and from that to my output node. Then I will click on the blur node that I just added, and I will increase the radius of that from the details panel. I'll increase it to 15, and right away you can see that I got the blur on top of my texture. So this could be all I wanted to achieve here, and then I can move forward with exporting my texture graph. But before that, let's try something else. Let's say, what if I wanted to multiply the color node that I got here with a noise node, so we can get a noisy color tint on top of our texture. So let's get rid of the blur node that we got here. Then I'm going to scroll down here, and under the procedural category, I will drag and drop the noise node to the graph, and then I will just drag a wire off the noise node and look for multiply, and then I will multiply the noise node with the color node that I got, and then I will just drag a wire out of that multiply to my previous multiply that I got here. So now you can see that the noise node is multiplied by the color node, and we should be getting a noisy color tint. But to make that effect more obvious, I need to change the noise parameters from the details panel. So I can change the noise type to a different type of noise, like a Perlin noise, but I'm going to change only some of the parameters of the noise, like the octaves or frequency, and stay with the simplex. for now. So I'm going to change the octave to a higher number, changing the frequency, then changing the amplitude of that to a higher number again, so I get a sharper noise. So now I get a nice noise, and then the result of the noise being applied on top of my initial texture is this. And then we got the brightness and contrast. It's too contrasty for now. I think I'm going to reduce that to something like this, or maybe just reset that and reset the brightness as well, or just adding a little bit of contrast there. So this is what I got here just by connecting a few nodes together, and without getting out of Unreal Engine. I did all my texture modifications and I'm happy with what I got here. So it was just to show you how we can modify our existing textures using a bunch of nodes, and by changing also some of their parameters or properties. But there could be also some scenarios that you might want to create a texture rather than modifying an existing one. So in this kind of scenarios, you can mainly rely on the nodes that you got under the procedural category. Let's say if you want to create a 2D noise texture, you just drag a noise node here and you connect it to your output nodes. And then, like I showed you earlier, you can change the parameter of that noise. Probably if you can change it to a Perlin noise, and then change the octave to a higher number to get a higher detail noise, and there you go, you got your 2D noise texture. So just by adding a node on your texture graph and connecting it to the output node, you are able to create a new texture. Let's say again, if you want to create a gradient mask, you can just drag and drop a gradient node and then connect it to the output node and change the type of gradient that you want. Probably if you want to change it to a radial gradient, you can do that, and then increasing the radius of that gradient, and there you go, you got the gradient mask. And you can also create some sort of shape masks as well using this shape node, and you can change the shape from circle being to triangle, and probably some other type of shapes that you got there. So it's really easy to create these type of masks just using the TextureGraph editor and without the need to get out of the engine and rely on other DCC tools. So now that we learned about modifying and creating textures inside TextureGraph editor, let's see how we can export the texture graph that we created here into a single texture asset inside Content Browser. For exporting our texture graphs, we have two different ways of doing that. So one way to do that would be through our TextureGraph editor. So we just need to open the texture graph that we got here inside the Content Browser. We'll double click on that and open it in the TextureGraph editor. And then we should set the right output settings for our output nodes, because basically we are going to export these output nodes. In this case, I have only one output node, but I could have several different output nodes, and for each one of them I have to make sure that I have the right settings for them. So if I just click on that output node, I can change the export parameters here in the details panel, or I could simply just expand the node by clicking on this arrow, and I can get all those parameters directly on the node, and I can change them right away from there. Let's say I can change the file name to a different name. I'm going to change it to T_albedo, and then I can also change the width and height of the texture. Right now it's set to auto, but I can set it to a 2K texture would be more than enough for me in this case, so I'm going to set it to 2048 by 2048, and I can also set the format for that. 8-bit per pixel RGBA is fine for me, and then I can also assign the LOD group and the compression settings, as well as the sRGB, which is allowing us to switch between a sRGB gamma color space or a linear color space. In this example, since it's going to be an albedo texture, I'm going to check that checkbox, but in cases where we want to create a mask texture or an alpha channel type of texture, then we just need to keep it unchecked. The next thing that I can define here, and it's one of the most important parameters on every single output node, it's the path where we are going to export our texture. So I can just click on this icon, and choose the right folder and choose the destination where this texture is going to be exported. So right now I'll just keep it on the under the content folder and textures, and I'll just hit save. So now we are ready for the next step, which is going to be exporting the texture. And for that, I just need to click on this export button that I got here in the main toolbar. I'll just click on that, and then it's going to show me this dialog box where it's allowing me to choose the output nodes to export. So I could have probably several different output nodes on my texture graph. Right now, since I have only one, then we have only one output here to export. Then I'll just hit the export button here, and then I'm going to minimize that, and immediately you can see that we got this T_albedo, and here is the texture that we just created. You can see that we got this 2K texture with the exact same settings that we set on the output node of our texture graph. So this was basically how we can export the texture graph using the texture graph editor, but there is also another way of exporting texture graphs. But before showing that to you, I'm going to save this texture graph, and I will close the texture graph editor window. For the other way to export our texture graphs, you just need to right click on the texture graph asset that we got here in the content browser, and from the menu click on the export texture graph, the first item. And that's going to open the texture graph exporter window for us. Just please bear in mind that this texture graph exporter has been added in Unreal Engine 5.5. So for those of you who are using Unreal Engine 5.4, you still need to follow the first way that I showed you to export your texture graphs. So let's see what we got here in this texture graph exporter window. Here we have access to all our input parameters, so we can change and modify them. Then we can also change the export settings for each one of the output nodes that we got on the texture graph. On the right side, we got the 3D preview window, the 3D preview settings window, and we also got the preview for each one of the output nodes that we got here. So let's say if we got multiple output nodes on the texture graph, you can switch between them using this drop-down box here. So let's say if I'm happy with the input parameters and the export settings, I can move forward with exporting this texture just by clicking on this blue export button down here. But before that, I'm going to change the name for the texture. I will change it to T_albedo_2 because I already got T_albedo1. And then I'm also going to change the color tints here. So just to show you that we can change those values for our input parameters. So I can change it to a bluish type of color, and then I can hit the export button here, and immediately you can see that you will get a new texture in our content browser. So it was really easy and fast to export our texture graphs using the texture graph exporter. And the fact that we could change all our inputs and output parameters dynamically and without getting into the nodes, it's really powerful and interesting actually. Because in this way, when we use the texture graph exporter, the texture graph itself, technically it will be a reusable utility or a custom tool that every time before exporting, we can change our input and output parameters. So let's say if I want to apply this noise effect on any other texture asset, I can simply change this texture to any other texture asset that I got on my content browser. So I'm going to look for the default texture from Unreal. And immediately after selecting that texture, you will see that the noise effect is applied to that one. Then we can change the export settings on the output. I will change the file name to T_albedo_3, and then I'm going to change the size to a 1K texture this time. I'm also going to change the texture format to an 8-bit grayscale so we can create a noise mask here. And then since it's a mask, I'm going to disable the sRGB. And now I'm ready to export this texture again to my content browser. So I was able to export a new texture from the same texture graph but with different input and output parameters. And I can then repeat the same process again and again, and that's why my texture graph is acting like a reusable utility. A great example for that could be using the texture graph as a utility for creating channel pack textures or unpacking them. For instance, in some cases we might need to unpack the channel pack textures that we usually get with the Megascans assets. Here is the channel pack texture for the material that we got from FAP with this underscore ORM in the name. So I'm going to open that. So you can see that on each one of the RGB channels of this texture, we have a grayscale texture map. On the red channel, we have the occlusion map. Then on the green channel, we have the roughness map. And then on the blue channel, we have the metallic map. And the reason for using this kind of channel pack textures is to reduce the number of texture samples that we are using on a shader and also to reduce the texture memory. But as I mentioned earlier, there could be some cases that you might want to unpack these channel pack textures into single textures. So you can use those single textures independently. And in order to do this, I'm going to show you quickly how you can build a texture graph as a utility for unpacking the channel pack textures. To start with this, I'm going to create a folder inside my textures folder, and I'll name that texture unpacker. Then inside this folder, I'm going to create a texture graph. So from the texture menu, I'm going to create a texture graph, and I will name that TG underscore unpacker. Then I'm going to save that first and double click to open that inside the texture graph editor. So once the texture graph editor is opened, you can see that we already got this output node as a default node for us. Then the first node that we need to add here is going to be a texture input node. So I'm going to grab one from the nodes palette, and I'll make some space here because I'm going to add one more node. So here, since I'm trying to unpack the RGB channels of my texture node, then I'm going to grab the split channels node from the channels category of my nodes palette. There we also got the combine channels node, and we will only use that if we want to combine the channels together. But here we are trying to split the channels, that's why I'm using the split channels node. Then I'm going to connect my texture node with the split channels node, and from that I'm going to drag a wire off the red channel and connect it to my output node. So now we got an output for our red channel, but we need two more outputs for our green and blue channels. So I can either search for output here or drag an output node from the nodes palette. Then I'm going to rename these output nodes. Let's rename the first one to red and the second one to green. And then I can copy and paste this one again and name it blue. Now we can connect our green channel to the green output and the blue channel to the blue output. And the last thing that I need to do here is to make sure that I have the right settings on each one of the output nodes. So I'm going to select the first one, and then from the details panel I'll change the texture format to an 8-bit grayscale texture. Then I'll also change the name to output_1, but I'll keep the settings for width and height on auto because I want to keep the initial size of my texture. So I'm going to repeat the same thing on the second output node, 8-bit grayscale. Then on the third one, 8-bit grayscale and output_3. Now we are done with our texture graph, so I'm going to save that, and then we are going to open this texture graph with the texture graph exporter. And here on the texture graph exporter, I can simply set my texture parameter to the channel pack texture that I got, _ORM, and then immediately you can see the preview for the red channel on the node preview panel, and we also got the 3D preview. So I'm going to switch between the different output that I have here. That was the red one, and then this is the green channel, and this one is the blue channel. And since this is an ORM texture and ORM stands for occlusion, roughness and metallic, then I'm going to rename the file names accordingly. For the first one, I'm going to put the occlusion. The next one is going to be roughness. And the last one is metallic. Then I'm looking at the path for all the output nodes, and it looks good to me because it's going to be the same folder that I created initially. So finally I'm ready to hit the export button and unpack our ORM texture. And immediately, as you can see, we got our metallic, occlusion and roughness maps inside our content browser. So let's open them one by one. This is the metallic one, and this one is the occlusion, and this is the roughness map. So just by using this texture graph that we made quickly and the texture graph exporter without getting into the nodes, we managed to unpack our channel pack texture, and we can reuse the same texture graph for unpacking all the other channel pack textures. So with that being said, I'm going to wrap up this Unreal Engine crash course about TextureGraph. I hope you enjoyed the course, and thanks for following. Stay tuned for more Unreal Engine tutorials and courses, and have fun with TextureGraph.